This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. I want to welcome all the listeners who might be coming from the Voices of Deconversion podcast. Steve Hilliker is taking a brief break, and we wish him well in his new career and education goals. If you are joining us for the first time from the Voices of Deconversion podcast, I just want to personally welcome you. I hope that you find this podcast half as good as Voices of Deconversion. Welcome, and please let me know if you are interested in telling your story of deconversion or faith transition on this podcast. Reach out to me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. Also, if you like what you hear, please consider rating and reviewing the podcast in the Apple Podcast Store or wherever you get your podcasts. On to today's show. My guest today is Richard Swan. Richard is the director of London City Voices. What is London City Voices? On their website, London City Voices is so much more than your average London choir. We are a community, a group of friends, an interesting large group of drinking buddies, and we're also a dynamic, non-religious, non-audition community London choir. Unfortunately, I was unable to get some audio to put in the podcast here. You're going to have to take my word for it that you need to go check this out on YouTube. I will have links in the show notes for London City Voices. I really encourage you to check them out. If you happen to be in the UK area, you might consider joining them. London City Voices brings people together to sing in a choir setting, pop songs, songs you'd recognize, songs you'd know the words to. And in the process, Richard has created quite a community. In my conversation with Richard, we talk about the power of music. We talk about the power of community building, what it takes to be a community organizer. And we talk about his personal story of growing up Catholic, going to the Anglican church, and eventually becoming a Pentecostal until the doubts began to set in and he could no longer sustain his faith. Richard's story is complicated. It is not cut and dry. There are ups and downs. I think it's important to tell stories that are not black and white. Sometimes there are some gray areas. But I appreciate Richard's honesty and vulnerability as he tells his story. Here's my conversation with Richard Swan. Richard Swan, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you very much.
Richard, I have just recently discovered all the work that you're doing with London City Voices. Can you give me just the brief overview of what work you're doing there?
Yeah, so London City Voices is a huge non-audition community pop choir in London. We've got 4 branches, and people just come after work and get stuck in, and it's a massive community. I met my wife there. Lots of people have met their partners there. Lots of lifelong friendships. Yeah, it's a great place to sing. We do big concerts, we do festivals, and all sorts of other stuff.
Fantastic. We'll have links in the show notes for this. For the listener, this is definitely an audio experience that you have to go see. It's amazing. Hundreds of people in a choir singing pop songs that are just so familiar, and you connect to them so much when you hear them. It's fantastic. We have you on to tell more than just that story. We'll get into more about your work with London City Voices, and I want to talk about music and the impact on human beings that has. Mm-hmm. But first, I want to hear your story. On this show, we talk about our deconstruction and deconversion stories, and I understand that you have one. So what was your faith tradition growing up?
My faith tradition growing up was that I was Catholic. I am half South African, half Irish. I was born in Cape Town, and my mum was South African, and my dad was Irish. And so we moved to Dublin in Ireland when I was 6, 1976. And mum was actually from a sort of Protestant background, but she converted to Catholicism. I can't remember how it worked, but I think part of the agreement that they got married in a Catholic church was that they would bring their children up in the Catholic faith, and my dad was a very religious Catholic as well.
Okay.
Quite surprised he wasn't a priest, really. But yeah, I was in that tradition. I'm an only child. I was in that tradition until about the age of 16. So I went to Mass every Sunday.
Okay.
We moved from Ireland to England in 1984. So when I was 14, and went to Mass there with them. But it was a very different place, England, from Ireland. So, but Ireland in the 80s, everybody went to Mass, really.
Right.
England, not so much.
Yeah. So culturally, much stronger in Ireland itself.
Yeah.
And definitely not so much in England.
Yeah. So lots of people didn't go to church. I was quite shocked by this when I first moved over, and couldn't understand that people actually didn't go to church.
Right.
But most of the people that I knew in my school didn't go. A few did occasionally. There are only about 2 or 3 Catholics in my year that I know about. About age 16, I was in a school play, and there was a girl there who I really fancied.
Yeah.
I was actually in a boys' school, but we worked closely with a girls' school down the road. And she invited me along to her youth group, and so I went along to that. Yeah, I had other reasons for wanting to go along.
Sure.
But I really enjoyed chatting to people. So to backtrack a little bit, I was terrible at sport, quite a weak child, not interested in football or anything like that at all.
Yeah.
And very arty, always into music, always into arts, drama, and consequently didn't have that many friends.
Okay.
I knew a lot of people, but I really didn't. I was bullied quite a bit, and I didn't really feel that I fitted in. And so when I went to this youth group, I immediately felt, a warm welcome. And they were a lovely bunch of people. But they were a youth group based in the local Anglican church, so Church of England. And I started going along to their meetings, and then found myself reading the Bible probably more than I did as a Catholic, because Catholics don't really read the Bible. They do what they're told.
Yes, they go to Mass and
they believe the priests.
Right, exactly.
And then found myself challenged on a couple of times by the youth group leader, saying, well, with respect to our Catholic friend here, we don't believe that Mary is still alive, but that she was assumed into heaven. And I kind of went, not sure I do either. And anyway, to cut a long story short, I ended up kind of just deciding that I really probably wasn't a Catholic anymore, and I was more just a Christian.
Okay.
And then I turned 18, went to university, went to Goldsmiths College in London to do music, and joined the Christian Union. And it so happens that the Christian Union at Goldsmiths is pretty hardcore, pretty charismatic, Pentecostal, and they soon got rid of any any remaining Catholicism within me.
They beat it out of you.
Pretty much. And I was I just wanted to be accepted, really. And so I kind of went, okay, well, this seems... And I've always quite liked books about fantasy and things like that. I really loved all the C.S. Lewis stuff. Tolkien, all of that stuff that's my kind of genre. I'm a big sci-fi fan.
Yeah.
And all of that. And so the kind of Christianity that they were selling me was the Frank Peretti kind of...
Right, yes.
Era, and it was in that time as well. So this is like late 80s, 1988, that I joined Goldsmiths. And so I was seeing demons behind the sofa, and I was speaking in tongues and praying for miracles, and never really saw a miracle. Did speak in tongues, but used to kind of really, really fervently pray for stuff, and then it wouldn't happen, and I'd find a reason that to explain that away, and God's got a better way, and we don't understand his depths and everything.
So a few things, let me respond to just a couple of things. One that you said that I just think is very, very common is the very natural human need for community. So this is a pretty old story, right? That a girlfriend or a friend says, "Hey, come to our youth group,"
Yeah.
and you maybe experience a sense of community that you hadn't had before, and that is deeply compelling because you're a human being.
Yeah.
We are wired to be in community.
Yeah, those are my words as well. I use that exact phrase actually.
Yeah. Exactly. And then I think it's interesting as well. My background just so happens to have been Pentecostalism as well. And I felt like I was drawn to that over other traditions because it felt like it was something real. And I had a very similar experience over a long period of time of looking for a bona fide miracle, looking for a bona fide, I can point to that and say that was truly God, that was truly supernatural, and really not being able to honestly ever come to that conclusion.
Yeah. So I realize now that I'm not really wired to be able to suspend disbelief. And I did it for a long time under duress, really, but I was constantly questioning, but valued the community that I had too much to give up. I was prepared to cope with some cognitive dissonance in order to keep the community and to keep the friendships that I had. And I had some really, and I still have some great friendships from that era and from people who are Christians and who are well established there.
Yeah. I think there are many people sitting in pews today, if they were honest with themselves, would say exactly that. That they don't quite buy into the whole thing, but because they have so many connections to people who they care about, they're unwilling to let that go.
And also, I think there's a feeling of, for me, there was also a feeling of, blimey, I've invested quite a lot of time into this, and does it all go to waste? Does that just kind of negate the last 10 years of my life, or whatever? And you think that by changing your mind about whether it's true or not, it somehow negates all the decisions you made in the last 10 years.
Right.
And it doesn't, of course.
Yes.
The reality is that you're operating out of a different understanding and perhaps a better understanding of who you are and how you function and what's important to you. It's over the years it was gradually becoming clearer.
Right. So you mentioned kind of ceasing to be able to suspend disbelief. Was there a particular belief that really you found difficult to accept?
Well, there's this bit. I don't know if you're familiar with Father Ted.
No, I think I've heard someone mention it, but I don't have the context of it.
So Father Ted is an Irish comedy series, which is based around the life of two priests living on a remote island off of Ireland.
Okay.
And it's hilarious. Look it up. It's very, very funny.
Okay.
Especially if you or any of your listeners have a Catholic background and you haven't seen Father Ted, it's just fantastic. Very irreverent.
Yeah.
But there's one bit where all the bishops come around to the island and they're asking Ted and Dougal. Ted is the main priest and Dougal is the kind of the idiot sidekick. And they're asking Dougal, does he have any problems with his faith? And he goes, just one bit. Just the bit where God comes down and becomes a man and then does miracles and then dies on the cross and then rises again. And then that bit.
That bit. Yes.
So yes, there was lots of stuff that was chipping away all the time. But I carried on. I got married really young, at 21. And I met my wife in the church that I started going to, which was a church called Ichthus Christian Fellowship. So I graduated from Goldsmiths with a degree in music. I then did a PGCE, which is the postgraduate teaching diploma. And I then got a job in a school in North London teaching music. And all the while I was sort of developing more of a songwriting side as well, and obviously because I was so involved in the church looking at the Christian music scene, I released an album of Christian worship songs. I did quite a lot of work with Graham Kendrick, who wrote Shine Jesus Shine and lots of other very well known worship songs. I toured with Graham as his choir director. I then went freelance in '96. I went freelance for 3 years as a musician. I got an opportunity to work with a band called Delirious, who were again a Christian band, and I then did lots of bits and pieces in the Christian music scene, but it was really hard work. At that time, I just had a baby. My ex-wife had a baby, and then we had another one. So that's Ben and Matthew. And then I went back to work in teaching.
Can I pause you just for a
Yes,
second?
of course.
So you mentioned that it was very difficult work in the Christian music world.
Yeah.
Did you have a sense of a disparity between what was publicly shown and what you were actually seeing behind the scenes?
So I didn't explain that very well. When I say difficult work, so it was difficult making a living out of it.
Okay.
I was taking every job that went, really. I was just taking anything.
Right,
I did. I was doing typesetting for a publisher, all sorts of stuff, and it was really quite desperately boring as well.
Okay.
But all the time there was this, I suppose, this cognitive dissonance knocking on my brain all the time. And I was leading worship in church on Sunday mornings, and yet I'd had a couple of affairs.
Okay.
Yeah, I was not happy in my marriage, and yet somehow it was okay to then stand up on the Sunday morning, having prayed forgiveness, and lead people in worship, and people responded.
Right.
Of course. So people would be there singing songs that I'd written and other ones that I hadn't, with their arms in the air in an A-level in ecstasy. And it seemed to be working, and I didn't like the fact that it was working, because it didn't make sense to me that it seemed to be, yes, the Bible says that you can ask for forgiveness and you'll be forgiven, but really I shouldn't be doing this, and it shouldn't be working like this, and it still seemed to be working like this, and that was causing problems for me.
Yeah, I want to just speak to the listeners who might still be believers. Whenever a guest of mine shows some real honesty like you just did, I like to indicate, let's not use this against Richard. Him being honest about what he was feeling, what he was going through, mistakes made. And, it's easy to point the finger and say, well, that's hypocritical. But the pressure that worship leaders, pastors, various church leaders are under to have a public persona that is perfect and clean and without blemish, and then reality of being a human being in the world is often unsustainable.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that was your experience.
Yeah. And my ex-wife and I had, so we have a very good relationship now. We didn't for a while, but I think I could say that I got married much too young. I was 21, and I didn't know who I was at 21.
Right.
And so by the time I was 27, 28, I was beginning to find stuff out about myself. And a lot of that led to me going, I'm not sure what to do here in this relationship. Really, I should have just got out of it if I was being honest and full of integrity. But I didn't have the guts to do that. I was terrified.
Right.
Because that would have meant not only leaving my marriage, but leaving my children, depending on which year you catch me, and the church, and lots of my friends. And actually, it was more complicated because my parents lived with us, as did her mother. So it was all one massive big house, and
that would be complicated.
It was really complicated. Yeah. So this went on for a number of years. I'll cut it a bit short. It started coming through to me that something had to change, and that I couldn't sustain this level of disparity between what was going on in my head and the outward display.
Right.
As I say, I'd released this album, and I was really looking to try to sort of have this career in Christian music, in this niche area. But I realized that I wasn't really believing some of the stuff that I was saying I was.
Yeah.
And I did two things. This is a number of years later now. In 2006, I did a diploma in life coaching,
Okay.
an online course, and I also read a book by Derren Brown. Are you familiar with Derren Brown?
Is that the UK? He's a performer. He does like almost faith healings as a
Well, he's a magician and,
magician. There you go.
an illusionist and
Mentalist is the word. Yes.
mentalist, yes. And so he did this whole thing about faith healings, which was a later show, but he was kind of showing how that it's nothing to do with the supernatural stuff at all.
Right.
But I read his book called Tricks of the Mind, and when I read it, very early on in the book, it just made me go, oh my goodness. The thing that is holding me back, really, there are two things which are holding me back. One of them is my non-existent faith, or very rapidly dwindling faith.
Right.
And the other is my dysfunctional marriage. And at the same time I was doing this life coaching course, one of the questions that was asked was, what is holding you back from fulfilling the desires that you have? And I had to write that, and I remember typing it in and feeling like that I was going to be possibly smote from above.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. But I remember going, I've never actually said that out loud or typed that out loud before,
Yeah.
And it was about the same week, I think, that I had a friend around. We'd just come back from a music meeting in town, and I was on. I don't know if you've ever heard of Second Life.
Yes, the video game. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a sort of it's a community as well. But I was showing him Second Life. I was doing some gigging in Second Life and things, and I was showing him, and it was about 2 a.m. or something like that. We were sitting at the kitchen table. My ex-wife came downstairs, and she was furious, and my friend made a quick exit.
Yes.
And we had this kind of showdown, and she said something like, what would God think about all this? What would Jesus think about all of this that you did, all of this stuff that you're doing? And I said, well, do you know what? Maybe I just don't think he's there. Maybe I just don't believe in him anymore.
Right.
And I remember there was this silence, and you could cut it with a knife. It was tangible. I'm not quite sure what happened next, but I know that the next day I said, right, I think this is time now for me to step back, and I'll still come to church, but I'm going to come to church as an observer.
Okay.
As if I was somebody who you just invited along.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to see what I think of it all, because I didn't want to stop going with the family.
Right.
And I didn't want to lose contact with everybody, but I made it really clear that I was no longer going to be part of the worship team. And I suddenly it was like this compulsion. I had to make sure that everybody knew this.
Yeah.
Because it just couldn't go on any longer.
Man, I think the pressure, too, for a worship leader is pretty strong. What was that like then when you did step down? How did other people besides your family respond to that?
Confusion, generally. A couple of people really got where I was coming from. They are the people who I guess we have a lot in common.
Yeah.
And we have a similar. You can see some people thought like I did, but they weren't going to rock the boat.
Right.
For a number of years now, probably 20 years now, I've been somebody who doesn't. I'm not that worried about rocking the boat. From being this shy child, suddenly I was like, for example, in home group meetings, I would always be the one who was going, but why is it not okay to be gay? Why is it,
right.
All of these kind of questions, and always the one who would be putting in the slightly awkward argument that everybody wished I'd stayed at home,
Right.
And so some people weren't surprised at all. Other people were quite shocked and didn't know how to handle it and were quite angry at me. I was sort of letting the side down. I was showing weakness. I was letting the rota down, for the worship team and things like that.
Yeah.
And it sort of threw the place into some disarray for a little while. But I went along, and I went along to this a house party, sort of a weekend away. And I remember feeling so isolated on this supposedly family weekend away, and looking around the room going, what the fuck is this about? And just really being quite almost appalled at how insular it had all become, and how it was all just in this little comfortable little world, you know?
Yeah.
And nobody was really thinking about the big issues in the world and how to solve them, and how,
right.
you know, it was all about theology and revival. Revival was the
yes.
You know, we're still praying for, well, they're still praying for revival, guys.
Yeah.
And so that, I mean, it was quite a strange time in my life, that, and a very, very confusing one. And then I remember getting asked questions by my children, things like, "Daddy, people say that you don't believe in Jesus anymore, or you're not a Christian anymore." And at that time, it was very, very, very new to me.
Yeah.
And I wasn't actually that comfortable agreeing with that. So I just said, I've just got too many questions at the moment to be able to say that I am a Christian. I've got too many questions bubbling up. And so I kind of put that off for a bit. And then about 8 months later, I think it was, maybe up to a year later, I decided that it was the time to leave my marriage.
Okay.
That took, I mean, that's another story,
Sure.
really. But that then had a completely massive effect on my social life.
Right.
So thankfully, all the way along, since about 2001, I had got involved with, I'd set up a band, or I'd been involved with a number of function bands, so wedding band type setups. So nothing to do with my faith at all. And a lot of these guys were the guys who held me through this time, because a lot of the friends that I'd made there weren't bothered about the fact that I'd left my faith, and indeed that I was leaving my marriage. They were just interested in me as a person, which you kind of thought that it might be the other way around, but it wasn't.
Yes, exactly. You definitely find who your real friends are.
Yeah, you do. Quickly. You do. And not everybody in the church deserted me by any means, but a number of people. I think the best way of describing this would be that people just didn't know how to behave with me, and they didn't know what to say. I think that a number of people were quite scared of opening up a conversation about faith, because they knew that I would say things that they would not know how to deal with and how to argue with, without using some sort of circular reference. You know, why should you believe the Bible? Because it says in the Bible. Because, you know,
yes,
we're all familiar with those. And I think many people didn't want to open up those discussions because they were too afraid that it was, well, this could so easily be me. I mean, yes. I can't say that people for definite thought this, but that's how I feel. That's how it comes across to me. But I was totally dropped like a stone by some people.
Yeah.
It was made very clear to me that for some people, the only way for me to remain friends with them would be for me to be back in fellowship with the church.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a fairly clear indication to me that I did not need to be their friend.
Right. Yeah.
And I honestly, and I've said this a number of times to my friends, but it felt like a reverse testimonial. It felt like the scales had fallen from my eyes, and suddenly I was seeing the world how it actually was, and how I had been cocooned in this world, and I felt like I'd left a cult.
No, I relate to that so much. I mean, the words "I was blind and now I see" resonate with me even more now. Post-deconversion, post-deconstruction. It absolutely is like a reverse testimonial. There's just your observation of the world, of what reality is, has changed, and it is unbelievably dramatic.
I remember when I was at university, there was this one guy, I'd love to know where he is now, Gary, who was an ardent atheist, and he was a lovely, lovely guy on our music course. And some friends of mine and I used to constantly nag him about coming to church and
Yeah.
why he didn't believe, and that we would say that you just don't know what you're missing, and he would constantly go, no, I do know what I'm missing, and it's nothing. I'm not missing anything.
Right.
He was totally right.
Yes. Yeah.
Gary, wherever you are, I'm sorry. It was an incredible experience to sort of come to this newfound freedom. And I don't mean just licentiousness. In fact, the opposite. But it was a newfound freedom of thought. That's all, really.
Right.
Freedom of thought.
Right.
I then, of course, went a little bit wild. Once I'd left my marriage, slept around a bit. I'm not proud of that particularly.
Yeah.
But I never did it in my 20s, and here I was in my 30s, late 30s, kind of going, wow, okay, this is different.
I think this is really common. People who have lost their teenage years, their 20s, to basically suppressing their sexuality, suppressing just being free to, explore yourself and what you are interested in. And then those reins come off, and there can be a time of maybe a little lack of self-control.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I felt like an adolescent, and I pretty much was an adolescent in lots of ways. That's my mindset, and exploring all this, just how the world worked, really. Mm-hmm. Although it was, in one way, it was awful because I was dealing with a marriage breakup. Obviously, I'd left my children in the marriage, and with my wife, and I wasn't worried about that because I knew she's a great mom, and I've always thought that. But obviously, I wasn't with them, and I'd also left my parents in that house.
Oh wow! Okay.
And so I would come back to visit them, and then they'd be shouting, and they'd be, my kids were taking sides. Well, they were sort of. I remember my eldest Ben was siding with me against his mum, and I felt awful about that. That settled down, it took a little while. The hilarious thing here, as an aside, is that one of my ex-wife's really good friends, who is also one of my really good friends and was my ex-girlfriend from a long time ago, from predating my ex-wife.
Right.
She's the one who put me onto your podcast in the first place.
Oh, okay, all right.
But she was at the time thoroughly into the church and wrote me this long email about how I knew deep down inside that God was there, and that he was crying, then he was, and it was this awful email, which I was just going, I don't know how to respond to this, because I would not be doing this. This is the hardest thing I've ever had to do. This is not the easy way out. I would not be doing this if I didn't believe really strongly that this is the right thing to do for me at this time.
Just want to comment on that. I really think that the believers in our lives, our friends, our loved ones, if they could understand one thing, it's that no one does this for hedonistic, licentious
Absolutely no
decisions. This happens to a person.
Yeah.
And you are left with the wreckage, and you are just trying to survive the process.
Yeah.
No one does this because they think, I don't want to follow God anymore, right? Like that just, I mean, maybe there's one or two people out there, but the vast majority, and at least anecdotally, everyone I've interviewed, it's a tragic experience.
It's not the easy way out.
It's definitely, there's nothing easy about it.
No,
whatsoever.
Absolutely not. And it's yes, there are. Well, there's freedoms both ways, aren't there? There's freedoms if you stay in, and you can live with that. Either it doesn't bother you at all, and you don't think about these things. But then there's the freedom to go, okay, well, I'm here and I'm happy. If you get out, then it's the freedom to go, yes, well, I'm going with my beliefs, and yes, I can have sex with people, and I believe God's not going to judge me, but I'm having to leave everything that I've spent the last X amount of years building up, including family.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember this incredulity when I read this email, going, oh, blimey, this is going to be hard to explain. But
yeah.
Anyway, she and her husband have now completely turned around, and as I said, they were the ones who put me onto you.
Oh, that's fascinating. That is a great story.
And we're all friends. It's great. My ex-wife is still friends with them. Myself and my current wife, the current Mr. Swan, have been down to stay with these friends, and we had a long talk about podcasts like yours and resources that are online to enable people to make the transition a bit easier.
Yeah.
Which didn't exist back then.
Absolutely, yeah. Even when I had my experience with, which was just around 2015, there were only a handful. There were only 2 or 3, and now there are many more resources out there for people. So,
yeah.
But to your friends, thank you so much for recommending the podcast. That's awesome. So I want to talk a little bit about the impact of music in general. I've had a few worship leaders on who have talked about both the power of music and the sense that they are providing a context, and a kind of a jaded way of looking at it might be manipulating the audience in a way. Is that something that you recognize
totally
was a part of your experience?
100%. So I remember thinking this on one of my Sunday mornings after probably quite a sinful week.
Okay. Yeah.
And it was a Sunday morning, and I was singing a song that I think I had written. I think it was that one. And I remember seeing people with their arms in the air and thinking, I think this might be a formula. And I think this might be a combination of poetry and words which are resonating with people and what their belief system is.
Yeah.
Plus scales and direct more melody, a combination of melody and harmony.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually kind of thinking, I think I know what the harmony and melody thing is, and I think it happens a lot, and I can see it happening in a lot of worship songs, that you get to this particular point, you can guarantee that half the congregation is going to put their arms in the air.
Yeah.
And it's not just the build-up and the drums and everything, but it's actually the shape of the melody. And I think there are certain patterns within music which just really speak to the emotion.
Yeah.
And that you almost can't help but be moved by.
Yeah.
And I really do believe that. I'd love to do a PhD in it or something like that if I had the time. But, I play a lot with emotion now in writing choral arrangements. And I kind of know what's going to work, because I know, and it's neither good nor bad. It's just, it can be used for good or bad, depending on what you do with it. But actually, inherently, it's just, we are, like you said earlier, we're being wired for community. We're wired to find music emotive.
Mm-hmm.
And certain things that you can do in music is going to be more emotive than others.
And pop music is pop because there's a hook in there, there's a melody or a breakdown or something that just grabs you and connects you to that music.
Yeah.
And then you would say then the similar thing in worship music.
So you take an old song like an old Irish song like "Oh Danny Boy," which most people know. And my dad could not sing that song without bursting into tears.
Yeah.
And I know what he means, because I feel the same. I don't think it's just our heritage or anything. I think it's just that song is constructed in such a way which it really, really, it just pulls deep into the emotions.
Right.
And I think you can do that. And I think those are the most successful pop songs, the ones that really they hit you inside,
Yeah. Well, and then you add on to what you're describing of just the technical aspects of the music itself, and you add on a cultural layer and maybe a family layer, and all of these connections to a piece of music can literally bring you to tears every time you hear it.
Yeah. And I do remember just being there on a Sunday morning thinking, I think I'm not sure the Holy Spirit is terribly involved with this.
Yes. Thank you for your honesty. I think recognizing that you weren't really living up to what the public persona was, and yet it was still effective.
Yes.
The music still elicited the experience that people wanted from you.
Yes.
And that disparity, that recognition that, I've been told that this is about the Holy Spirit, this is something outside of me that is doing it, and you start to recognize that's not necessarily true.
Yeah, and so I think this ties in very much to, I guess over the last few years, I've So I'm no longer in a place where I feel I need to constantly hear other people's deconversion stories and that I need to feel vindicated by them, because I've kind of moved on, and this has been important for me. This is still important for me to be able to tell my story, but I don't feel I need to find a way of moving on, because I have moved on.
Right.
And I'm getting on with what I feel I need to do in life and change the status quo and, make a difference, I suppose. So I have mixed views on various writers, but I remember one of the people that I read pretty much as soon as I started getting out of church stuff was Sam Harris. And I have mixed views about Sam Harris.
Sure. I've had nuanced perspective on Sam as well, so but yes.
Again, this is, like with the Bible, you can still take bits from it and they're okay.
Right.
I remember reading something, and I can't even quote it, but I remember getting the feeling that, so it's presented to you that religion or Christianity has the answers, and that anything in the real world is just an imitation of that.
Right.
And actually, it's the other way around. And we are, like you said earlier, we're wired to be in community. That is a human thing. That's not a Christian thing. That's a human thing. And
yes.
Church gives us a bit of that.
Yeah.
But it also gives us a load of negative stuff.
Right.
Which we don't need. Music, response to music, emotional response to music. We're built for that.
Yeah.
Church can give us a little window on that. And because it's, like I said, if it's linked to your belief system, then it's going to impact in an even bigger way.
Right.
Or not, because maybe you're a humanist and you just bloody love music. You really love. And that is no less of an experience.
Right.
The church side of it is just one facet of our emotional response to music or art or whatever. And I feel it's been portrayed as the other way around. And so the thing that really annoys me is when people go, I'm not a churchgoer, I'm not a Christian, but I kind of agree with all the things, all the positive things that it brings. And you're going, but think of all the negative things that it brings.
Yes.
And all the positive things that it brings are not exclusive to the church. They're just available in humanity.
Right.
That's the bit, and that's what really annoys me.
Yeah. Well, you've just expressed something I've been, trying to restate in various different ways, to say that, I often talk to believers and they'll say, well, humanism really borrows from Christianity. And I have to remind them that, no, Christianity borrowed from, it wouldn't have been called humanism, but basically the early philosophers, and Jesus was a humanist. What that just means is human focus, that we care about human rights, care about human dignity, care about loving people.
Yeah.
And that it's absolutely the other way around, that religion has pulled that out and then claimed exclusive rights, which it does not have.
Yeah.
And so this gives me a really good segue, Richard, in that the thing that I'm really fascinated about, and one of the things I want to promote as often as possible, is how we take that knowledge that this really is a human thing, that the human need for community, the human need to sing with one another, to have music be a part of that connection, that sense of being a part of something bigger than ourselves, but recognizing we can do that as just human beings. And it turns out you have done that really, really well. So if we turn the corner here of how you've now used your skills for the good and with London City Voices, how did that become a thing? And let's describe that in more detail.
I'll backtrack slightly. So after I
Sure.
Went wild and then stopped going wild, I was running a function band. I took it seriously then. Mm-hmm. For a while, and that was going fine until the bottom fell out of the economy in 2008.
The last time.
Yes. And then I did a little bit of teaching again, and then only just enough to realize that I didn't want to do that, and it wasn't really for me. That teaching is not a place for somebody who's a bit of a maverick. And so I was doing some private teaching, and then somebody got in touch and suggested that I might like to direct their community choir for a term. They were changing director every term and seeing how that worked. And so I went along, and I discovered that I loved doing it, and they really loved me. And so I thought, oh, this is good. So they asked me back for a term, and then they asked me to stay,
Mm-hmm.
and I thought, this is great. I'm really enjoying this. And then we were at a little local gig in a pub, and back in the days when we could actually go to pubs.
Yes, in the olden days.
Yeah, one of the guys there said, "Oh, this is my last event with you because I'm moving out of London, and I'm still going to work. I'm still working in London, but I'm going to find a choir I can go to after work."
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, "Oh, there's an idea. I could.
Yeah.
This would work in town somewhere if I set up a choir." And so I did, and I found a great venue, lovely place called St Mary at Hill, which is an old Christopher Wren building.
Okay.
Beautiful place, great acoustic, gorgeous piano. And I decided, right, I'm going to do this. I didn't have very much money. In fact, I was quite a lot in debt, but I was surviving, and I hired it at a pretty good rate, and got some leaflets printed and sort of handed them out and stuff. And I had for a year, I had about maybe between 10 and 18 people coming along to this thing, and I was kind of hemorrhaging money. It wasn't working very well. And then I just thought, right, okay, what can I do about this? And so I changed some of the ways the pricing worked. But one of the biggest things, I took inspiration from a Christian, and I happened to be going to an early morning breakfast meeting. Have you come across BNI, which is Business Network International? It's networking. It started in the States.
Okay.
I was going to an early morning breakfast meeting, and there was a guy on London Bridge, and I walked across London Bridge to get this meeting, and he had leaflets in his hand, and he was just thrusting leaflets into people's hand going, "Believe in Jesus, believe in Jesus, believe in
Yes.
Jesus." And I went, this is a really good idea. You've got thousands of people walking towards you.
Yeah.
So I had some more leaflets printed, stood on that bridge for 2 hours every morning for a couple of weeks, and had 27 people at my first one of the new year.
Oh, wow.
And we've just never looked back since then. So it just grew and grew and grew and grew.
That's guerrilla marketing for you.
Yeah, it's go where the people are. That was the thing. The thing going through my head was, I'm good at this. People really like what I do. And so it's not a case of whether the thing works or not. It's a case of how can I get in front of more people?
Yes.
We've tested the product works, but just not enough people know about it. And
You've just described my podcast.
yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. So we started to grow, but the thing that was really important, and I knew this from the very, very first meeting, even when we had about 10 people in the first meeting, we went to the pub afterwards and we sat and chatted. And I remember sitting upstairs. We were sitting upstairs in this little kind of restaurant bit because there was nowhere else. And I just remember thinking, this has got to happen every single time. We have to go to the pub afterwards because this is where people start to get to know each other. And that's what draws people to it. It's not just the singing. The singing is good, but there's lots of places you can do singing. But what you want is singing and family. And that's what church is. That's what draws people to church. It's singing and family and community. And I remember one of those fairly early meetings when we had maybe 25 people or 30 people in the session. And I remember going to the pub afterwards. We were in this tiny little room, and one of the guys said, there's so many classes I've been to after work to try and find something to do. Been to martial arts, been to acting, been to all these things. And everybody just goes home afterwards.
Yeah.
And here we were. And that started, that just reinforced in my head, this is really important, the community side of this.
Yeah.
And so it has just grown and grown. And this year we'll have our 5th wedding from people who met in the choir.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's cool.
Including me and my wife. And I've just found out a couple of weeks ago that we'll have our first LCV baby.
Congratulations.
Who from 2 people who met in the choir. So
right.
And this is astounding. But we've tried to, for example, during this time of lockdown, people really miss the choir.
Yeah.
They miss getting together because we have four meetings a week, 4 rehearsals a week, so people can come multiple times if they want to, and many people do, because each group's got a slightly different vibe.
Yeah.
And people miss that, so we've tried to put on as much as possible for them. And we've just had this great project going on where, because our spring concert was cancelled, and it's normally a huge thing, and everybody was really looking forward to it. there'd normally be 1,500 people there to watch.
Yeah.
And so I got them to do this video. They all sent in a video, and we put them together, and we've got 276 of them singing "You've Got a Friend," and we've just raised nearly £50,000 for a domestic abuse shelter charity.
Okay.
Those kind of things are really important because they make people know that they are part of a bigger thing.
Yeah.
Which again is the whole church thing. You know, people like to think that they're part of something that's bigger than them, and that's what this gives.
Yeah.
But without the dogma. We do have a hashtag, not a cult.
Yes.
And for your listeners who can't see me on the Zoom, you know, I have long hair and a beard, and there has been
speculation.
Well, people have just drawn, you know, said it's quite funny that you're from a religious background and now you lead this group, you know, huge group of people. Do you think that this is how we're born to be? We're born to be in a community of positivity.
Yeah. So I want to commend you in that I've been on a search for secular communities, and I use the word secular here as generic as possible. So non-religious communities, and we talk about it constantly, like how can we get people together? How can we bring a sense of connection? And there have been multiple attempts, things like Sunday Assembly, various other, secular church-like groups that are there for a while and they die out. But it sounds like you have just found a recipe for success. Like you are actually doing it. It's just amazing.
Yeah, and I'm doing it for a living. It's actually far more lucrative than teaching was. So from my point of view, I think that a lot of the things like the Sunday Assembly, and they work to a point, and I've been to some, and I've been to the School of Life we've got in London, and there's lots of things like that. But
right.
They work to a point, but in some ways they're almost just like they're a replacement for church.
Right.
We used to have church, and now we have this. Whereas the point of London City Voices is that it's just people having fun and doing stuff that they really enjoy doing.
Yeah.
In community with each other, and we've got a nice successful way. You know, we always go to the pub. There's a sing-song in the pub afterwards, and
right.
that's every bit as important as the actual rehearsal.
Right.
And if you look at the video on the website, you'll see there's a sort of a 5-minute intro to the choir, and it's got footage from that, and you'll see what I mean. But I think if it's just replacing church, then church is still there in a way. It's the placeholder. It's the negative placeholder.
Right.
And this is just people doing what they like doing, and that can be football. You know, I can't stand football, but I can see. Right. You can see why football is so important for some people, because that's their tribe, that's their community.
Yeah.
Martial arts, sewing, whatever. These communities. I've picked one, fortunately for me, that I'm quite good at directing, and I've just got a bit of a way with them, I suppose, in terms of the way it's run, and that's just it's a personality thing.
Yeah.
This is definitely a cult of personality, if you like, because this is the way we are with each other.
Yeah.
Not everybody who runs a community is necessarily born to lead a community, if you see what I mean.
Right, yes. Yeah.
I do remember a number of years ago, my eldest son was walking around with me at a choir event, and we saw this particularly terrible choir. Not the singers themselves, but the way it was run. And I remember him just sidling up to me and going, that should be made illegal. Because it's giving choir a terrible name because of how it's being run. So not everybody who is leading communities should be leading communities.
True, yeah.
But I think there's not just one way to do this. There are many communities which can give that sense of belonging. It's why gangs are so important to the members of the gangs, isn't it? Because they need an affiliation.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, because I think from a kind of a sociological point of view, the same drive that brings someone to become a member of a gang is very similar to being a part of a religious group.
Yes.
And even the more high demand the religious group, the stronger that feeling might be. And so as secular people who want to build community, we need to find ways that allow people to feel connection without the negative baggage that you were describing.
Hmm.
And I think the challenge there is that particularly secular people, particularly maybe atheistic people, are, it's like herding cats. Finding something that they can all agree on or want to be a part of is super challenging.
So, I mean, this is one of these things which I constantly battle with in terms of leadership. So,
Mm-hmm.
you get to a point now, I'm running a choir of roughly 500 people. It's a significant podium, if you like.
Right.
There's 1,700 people on the mailing list or something like that. So, and half of those read my emails every week. So that's quite a responsibility.
Right.
But it's a responsibility which I take seriously, and I do want this to work, and I do want. So I've got a little bit of a not a committee exactly, but I've got a group of trusted people who around me who I say, right, okay, I'm thinking about this. What do you think?
Yeah.
I think people do want to be led. So I don't think you can have a community, a total democracy, if you like, because it gets split up, doesn't it, into factions and everything. If you've got one person who is benevolent dictator, I suppose,
yeah,
which I tend to describe myself as in it,
right.
And I said, right, I'm taking that post down because that, in our Facebook group, for example, that's out of order. And they know that's the way it works. They know it's not a democracy. But I do my best to listen to everybody in it.
Yeah.
So you do need somebody leading, but the problem is that you need. I'm not bigging myself up here. I'm just trying to say you need somebody leading who is actually understands that leading actually means serving.
Yes.
Which is what churches do say, don't they?
Yeah.
I've heard that line in churches where they say, "Well, we're your leaders, but we're here to serve you." But actually, that's right.
Yeah.
In order to lead, you have to be there to do as much as possible for your community.
I imagine that before any choir practice or even time at the pub or a performance, you've done hundreds of hours of work that make those things actually function.
Yeah. I don't begrudge those hours at all,
sure.
Because I know that it's by doing that work that A, I have a business, and B, I have a lovely community, and I have there's this thing which people have come up to me and said, I would not be alive if it was not for your choir.
Yeah.
And that's a sobering thing when people say that, but they have said it to me, and so it's a massive responsibility, but it's one which I'm very happy to shoulder that, because I feel like it's actually making a difference to the world.
I think so too. Again, I can't express to you enough, listener. You have to go to the YouTube channel and see this for yourself. First of all, it's pop songs that you're going to instantly recognize. You can sing most of the lyrics yourself, but the joy on the faces of the choir members is so evident. And some of the performances that are in front of live audiences, the people in the audience, their joy, and they're singing along. And it's just this incredibly powerful experience. You have to go see it for yourself. So, Richard, as we start to wrap up here, I think you've really touched on something very important about the need for leadership, the need for some people to stand up and be community leaders, community developers. If someone out there has a particular skill, maybe it's not choir direction, but some kind of skill, what are the things that they should be looking at to start communities around them based on whatever subject they find most interesting?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think the key is always looking for what are people looking for? What the question to always be asking yourself, I think, is what can I do? How can I make life better for people? Is there something that I can be doing that is going to make a positive contribution to this world? Because if you're the sort of person who asks yourself that kind of question, then you probably are going to be able to make a very positive contribution. If you're not going to be asking yourself that question in the first place.
Right, that's true. Yeah.
So self-selecting. But if you want to make a positive contribution to the world in a secular setting, I think it is just being realistic about what your skills and asking other people around you and saying, what do you think about this? And just testing things out, running things past friends and saying, what about if we did this? And then just doing it.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, you just have to try it. I had countless discussions with people about how teaching, I shouldn't be leaving teaching, how it was a job for life, it was a secure income. And, I had to say to my ex-wife on many occasions, look, it's okay. This is going to work. I know what I'm doing here. I do know what I'm doing. Excuse the vulgarity, but fuck the haters.
Yeah.
I'm being realistic here. I'm good at this, and I've proved that this works in certain situations. So I know that it's just a matter of transferring it across here.
Right.
And there's a great book which I really enjoyed, and I enjoyed it in hindsight, and it's called How to Fly a Horse. And it's all about tweaking things. So it's about not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. When you have a good idea, you kind of have a look at it and go, what's working, what's not working? And then you tweak the things that aren't working until you get it right.
Yeah.
And it's brilliant. Really, really good book. Thoroughly recommended. And that sort of mentality, I've sort of had that mentality for quite a long time, and kind of, right, why didn't that work? How can we make this better? And then you can start to build a community that matters and that does something for people, I think.
Fantastic. Richard, how can people get in touch with you or London City Voices? Give us your Twitter and YouTube.
We are on Twitter as London City Voice. There weren't enough characters for the extra S at the end.
Okay.
We're on Facebook, London City Voices. Our website is londoncityvoices.co.uk. Our YouTube channel is London City Voices. There's a theme coming out here.
Yes.
And you can email me on info@londoncityvoices.co.uk. You will either get me or my wife. And we are on Instagram as well, London City Voices, strangely enough.
Fantastic. Richard, thank you so much for sharing your story and the wonderful work that you're doing.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, David.
Final thoughts on the episode. As I said, Richard's story is a complicated one. It gets into areas of shades of gray, but I appreciated his honesty and vulnerability in telling all the gory details. And I especially don't want you, if you are a believer, if you are a part of the faith still, to judge Richard for his honesty. His honesty is the result of being free from the shackles of religion to tell the actual truth. His honesty about being a worship leader and going out and partying, and yet still the same exact effect takes place as people raise their hands in worship, is not an indication of Richard being wrong. It's an indication of the system being wrong. The whole idea of attributing all this to a deity is the problem. A few quotes from Richard. It seemed to be working, and I didn't like the fact that it was working because it didn't make sense to me. And then he talks about his deconversion and walking away. This is the hardest thing I have ever had to do. This is not the easy way out. I would not be doing this if I didn't believe really strongly that this was the right thing to do for me at this time. Again, Richard's honesty in telling his story is just fantastic. And then the work that Richard is doing with London City Voices. As I said to him in the conversation, we are constantly talking about how do you build secular community. And Richard has figured out a way to do that, bringing people together. And as he points out, that the after choir practice pub sing-alongs are just as important as the practice itself, that the building of community, bringing people together to talk with one another, to connect with one another, to give them that opportunity, that is what we need. Religion does this really, really, really well. And we need to be able to copy that. We need to find ways to recreate the human connections that we need. I just want to encourage you, listener, if you have any skill, if you have the leadership qualities that Richard was describing, if you have the urge, the desire, the impetus to go out and begin community building, that you can do that. Go find where you can make an impact. And it can start small. It can start with 2 or 3 people, a book club, a knitting circle, a running club, anything that you find interesting. I guarantee you there are other people around you who find that interesting too. It doesn't have to be centered around not believing in God. It can just be regular everyday activities. I understand I'm saying this in the middle of a pandemic and lockdown, so the actual getting together part might actually need to wait a little while. But in the meantime, starting a Zoom conversation over your favorite book or your favorite music genre or your favorite movies can have the same effect in this lockdown time. My secular grace thought of the day is you can do it. You can be that secular community builder. You can do it. I really want to hear your stories as you go out and begin creating community. Let me know. Email me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. I want to hear how it goes, what succeeds and what doesn't. Again, I want to thank Richard for being on the podcast, for being as vulnerable as he was, for sharing his insight into community building. And I will have the links in the show notes for the London City Voices. I can't express enough how much you need to go and check them out on YouTube. The joy in the faces of the singers and the audience and Richard himself is just palpable. So please go check them out and encourage you to sing along. Find some people to sing with. I think music, as Richard and I discussed, is so powerful. And maybe in our Western individualized culture, we don't do that as often, maybe because it's embarrassing or we're not the greatest singers. But I encourage you to find people around you who you can sing with. That's such a powerful, connecting human need. Until next time, I have been David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for some footnotes. The song is a track called Waves by Micaiah Beats. Please check out her music. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to help support the podcast, here are the ways you can go about that. First, help promote it. The podcast audience grows by word of mouth. If you found it useful or just entertaining, please pass it on to your friends and family. Post about it on social media so that others can find it. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. This will help raise the visibility of our show. Join me on the podcast. Tell your story. Have you gone through a faith transition? You want to tell that to the world? Let me know and let's have you on. Do you know someone who needs to tell their story? Let them know. Do you have criticisms about atheism or humanism, but you're willing to have an honesty contest with me? Come on the show. If you have a book or a blog that you want to promote, I'd like to hear from you. Also, you can contribute technical support. If you are good at graphic design, sound engineering, or marketing, please let me know and I'll let you know how you can participate. And finally, financial support. There will be a link on the show notes to allow contributions which would help defray the cost of producing the show. If you want to get in touch with me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, or you can send email to gracefulatheist@gmail.com. You can tweet at me at gracefulatheist, or you can just check out my website at gracefulatheist.wordpress.com. Get in touch and let me know if you appreciate the podcast. Well, this has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Grab somebody you love and tell them how much they mean to you. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.